A frozen cabbage leaf skids across churned mud as a leather ball, half deflated, rolls past a German helmet propped as a goalpost. The year is 1942. The city is Leningrad. Emaciated men in mismatched kits chase it under a gray sky, their breath shallow, their bones visible through threadbare shirts, while artillery rumbles a distant bass line. Football did not stop for war. It became a theater of defiance, a calculated tool of survival, and a gamble where the stakes were not a scoreline but a firing squad. A pitch could be a minefield, a prison yard, or the frozen ruts of no man's land. The game was played under the gaze of snipers, the orders of propaganda ministers, and the crushing weight of starvation. What transforms a sport into a weapon, and what happens to the men who are forced to pull the trigger with their feet? Today, 10 deadly games where the final whistle meant life or death. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe, so you make it all the way to the #1 spot. Now, let's start the countdown. The Kharkiv match of 1943. In the summer of 1943, the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv was under German occupation, its factories repurposed for the war effort. At a locomotive plant, a group of workers formed a football team, much like Kyiv's FC Start. Many were former players from local clubs. On an August day, they faced a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft unit on a makeshift pitch. The Germans expected a routine victory. Instead, the factory team won 5-1. The match was played under an unspoken threat. Armed soldiers watched from the sidelines, and rumors of reprisals for defiance were common. Yet the Soviet players did not hold back. Their motivation was not just sport, it was a quiet act of resistance in a city where collaboration meant survival. The German commander, furious at the humiliation, reportedly warned the players afterward. Within weeks, the Gestapo arrested several of them. They were interrogated, accused of sabotage and anti-German activity. At least 3 were executed. The exact number remains unclear, as records were destroyed or never kept. The Kharkiv match lacked the propaganda machinery of the Kiev death match, and for decades, it was forgotten. No monuments were built, no films made. It survives only in fragmentary testimonies and a single photograph of the team. The players knew the risks and chose to play anyway. Their victory was not a strategic blow, but a psychological one, a moment of dignity under occupation, paid for with their lives. The death match, FC Start versus Falklands, Kiev 1942. On August 9th, 1942, at Zenith Stadium in occupied Kiev, a team of Ukrainian bakery workers faced a German Luftwaffe flak unit in a football rematch. The bakery team, FC Start, was composed mostly of former Dynamo Kiev and Lokomotiv Kiev players. They had already beaten Falklands 5-1 3 days earlier. The Germans demanded a revanche. An estimated 2,000 spectators paid 5 karbovanets each to watch. Start won again, 5-3. The match itself was fair. No SS threats, no armed dogs, no rigged officiating. The referee did not manipulate the game. The players wore red jerseys simply provided by the Germans, not as a communist symbol. Yet, Soviet propaganda later transformed this game into a myth of martyrdom, claiming the players were executed for humiliating the occupiers. In reality, the arrests came 9 days after the match, and the deaths of the players were unrelated to the game. 3 were killed by the SS 6 months later, but for resistance activities, not football. The legend was a deliberate countermeasure to accusations that Kiev's inhabitants did not resist the invaders. The truth is more complex. A football match played under occupation, won on skill, and later twisted into a weapon of post-war propaganda. The Battle of the Bulge football match, 1944. In late December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had stalled into a frozen, brutal slugfest. American lines, initially shattered by surprise, had solidified around bastions like Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge. The German timetable was broken. Congestion on the narrow, icy roads and a desperate shortage of fuel for the panzer divisions had turned Hitler's grand counteroffensive into a grinding attritional nightmare. It was in this surreal, snow-smothered pause between the initial German shock and the Allied counterpunch that a strange event occurred. Near the front, a group of American GIs organized an impromptu football game. The match was a brief, irrational return to civilization played on a makeshift pitch of frozen mud and snow. The logic was purely psychological. These men were holding a thin, fragile line, exhausted and freezing, surrounded by the burnt-out hulks of tanks and the constant threat of artillery. The game served as a deliberate act of defiance against the chaos, a temporary reconstruction of a normal world that had ceased to exist. The ball itself was a precious, absurd object in that landscape of death. For a few minutes, the structure of the game replaced the structure of combat. The whistle, the rules, the shared focus on a meaningless leather sphere. It was a collective anchor against the disintegration of morale. The game ended. The men returned to their foxholes. The German offensive, though doomed, had not yet spent its final fury. The battle would rage for another month, consuming over 80,000 American casualties before the line was restored. The football match remained a fleeting, unrecorded moment of humanity, swallowed by the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. The Warsaw Uprising Match, 1944. On August 1st, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched a 63-day insurgency to liberate Warsaw from German occupation. By mid-August, in the liberated courtyard of a tenement house on Wilshire Street, soldiers of the Kalinsky Battalion organized a football tournament. The pitch was a patch of rubble-strewn ground, goals marked by jackets. Teams from different insurgent units competed over several days, with matches briefly pausing when shelling came too close. The tournament was not a single game, but a series of matches, a deliberate act of normalcy amidst the siege. Morale was the weapon here. The Home Army, outgunned and isolated, understood that sustaining the will to fight required more than ammunition. The games asserted that civilian life and Polish sovereignty persisted, even as the Germans counterattacked with tanks and Stuka dive bombers. The players were insurgents, some as young as teenagers, who returned to the barricades after the final whistle. The tournament ended as German pressure intensified. By October 2nd, the uprising collapsed. An estimated 16,000 Home Army soldiers and up to 200,000 civilians were dead. Warsaw was systematically razed. The football matches faded into memory, a fleeting moment of defiance, buried under the rubble of a destroyed city. Football in the Sand, the North African Front, 1943. By early 1943, the Tunisian campaign had locked Axis and Allied forces into a grinding stalemate along the Atlas Mountains. Supply lines were stretched, and the winter rains turned the ground into mud. For the British 8th Army and Commonwealth troops, holding the line meant weeks of static positions within earshot of artillery. Commanders faced a familiar desert war problem: how to keep infantry fit and cohesive when movement was limited and boredom bred carelessness. The answer was organized football. Units marked out pitches on any flat patch of sand or packed earth, using jerry cans for goalposts. Matches were structured into proper league tables, with referees, schedules, and trophies fashioned from scrap. The logic was direct. A soldier who sprints for 90 minutes maintains the wind needed for a sudden advance under fire. Team play reinforced small unit trust, the same instinct that keeps a section together. When a machine gun opens up, a ball could be dropped and men could hit the dirt in seconds. Games often continued through distant shelling. A near miss meant a pause, then a throw-in. The psychological payoff was just as critical. In a campaign where the front line blurred and death came from the air or from mines, the ritual of a match restored a sense of normalcy and control. It was a deliberate tool of morale engineering, as vital as ammunition. The football leagues of Tunisia were never officially sanctioned by the High Command, but they were quietly encouraged. They ended when the Axis surrender came in May 1943, the makeshift pitches abandoned to the sand. The Bolton Wanderers POW match, 1945. In the chaos following the fall of Singapore in February 1942, an entire professional football club vanished into captivity. The men of the 53rd Bolton Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, were not just soldiers. They were the core of Bolton Wanderers, including Captain Harry Gosselin and 14 other first-team players. They had volunteered together in 1939. A rare act for elite sportsmen who were usually kept away from combat. Now, they were prisoners of the Japanese, held in Changi camp. The guards, aware of their captive's fame, saw an opportunity. They ordered exhibition matches, the British prisoners against the Japanese guards. The psychological trap was immediate and cruel. Losing meant brutal punishment and a loss of face for the entire camp. Winning meant humiliating armed captors who controlled the rice ration. The players navigated this minefield with a professional's precision, understanding that the game's physics, ball control, pace, positioning could be a tool for survival. They played to control the score, not just the ball, managing the final result, to avoid provoking lethal retaliation while maintaining a shred of dignity. The matches became a focal point for camp morale, a strange echo of Burnham Park played out on dirt under a tropical sun. Harry Goslin did not survive to see the war's end. He was killed by shrapnel on the Italian front in December 1943, having been transferred out of Changi before the matches took place. The remaining players carried his memory onto that makeshift pitch, their survival a testament to a discipline forged long before the war. The Leningrad Siege Match, 1942. By spring of that year, Leningrad had been encircled for over 7 months. Daily bread rations had dropped to 250 grams for workers and 125 for everyone else. Over 600,000 people had already starved to death. The city was dying. But on May 31st, a football match was staged at the Dynamo Stadium. Dynamo Leningrad faced a team from the Baltic Fleet naval crew. The game was a propaganda operation designed to signal to the Germans and to the city's own population that Leningrad was still alive. The match itself was a physical collapse in slow motion. Players could barely stand. The Dynamo squad was assembled from surviving pre-war players and factory workers who had once played the sport. Many were brought straight from the front lines or hospital beds. The pitch was cratered, the grass gone. There were no full 90 minutes. Reports suggest 2 shortened halves of 30 minutes each. The players moved at walking pace, stopping to catch their breath. There was no tackling. A collision could mean a broken bone from malnutrition. The score was 6-0 to Dynamo, but the numbers meant nothing. The real outcome was that the match happened at all. It was broadcast via radio and loudspeakers across the city and the front line. The German command heard it. The psychological logic was simple. If men can still play football, the city has not been broken. The match was repeated in the following weeks with other makeshift teams. Most of the players who took part that day did not survive the siege. The stadium itself was later hit by shelling. The game existed only as a flicker of defiance, a message sent in starvation and exhaustion, then swallowed by the famine that continued for another 600 days. The Nazi Salute Match, England versus Germany, 1938. On the 14th of May, 1938, the England football team walked onto the pitch at Berlin's Olympic Stadium. 110,000 spectators filled the stands. The match was a friendly, but the context was anything but. 2 months earlier, Germany had annexed Austria. The British government, pursuing a policy of appeasement, was desperate to avoid giving Hitler a pretext for further aggression. The Foreign Office in London issued a direct order. The English players were to perform the Nazi salute during the playing of the German national anthem. The logic was one of pure diplomatic theater. A gesture of respect from English sportsmen would signal that Germany was not a pariah state, smoothing the political path for Neville Chamberlain's negotiations. The psychological pressure on the players was immense. They were not soldiers or politicians. They were footballers thrust into a geopolitical charade. Accounts differ on their willingness, with some reports suggesting a near mutinous reluctance that faded into weary compliance. The image was captured and broadcast worldwide, becoming an infamous symbol of political cowardice. The game itself was almost an afterthought. England won 6-3, a result that was routine for the era. For Hitler, the propaganda photograph of Englishmen with raised arms was the real victory. The salute did its political work, helping to clear the way for the Munich Agreement and the eventual dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. The England team flew home, leaving behind a photograph that would stain the reputation of British diplomacy for generations. The minefield match Falklands, War, 1982. By early June 1982, British forces were closing in on Port Stanley. The Royal Marines of 40 Commando had advanced across East Falkland, carrying packs weighing up to 54 kilograms through freezing peat bogs. Stress fractures were not just physical. Men who had been under intermittent shelling for days were operating on a knife edge of exhaustion and hypervigilance. The unit paused near the Two Sisters Mountains. The ground ahead was marked by Argentine anti-personnel minefields, laid in dense patterns with little documentation. The Marines knew the boundaries. They had been briefed on the precise GPS coordinates of the danger zones. Between two clearly marked minefields lay a flat, rectangular patch of short grass. It was roughly the size of a football pitch. The logic of what happened next was purely psychological. A non-commissioned officer looked at the clear ground, looked at the minefield markers, and made a calculation. The risk of a misstep into a mine was real and catastrophic, but the risk of a unit collapsing from internal pressure was also real. Organized physical exertion, specifically a game with rules and a clear endpoint, provides a temporary structure that counteracts the randomness of combat stress. The match was not a reckless dare. It was a deliberate, supervised release. Men played hard, knowing that a ball kicked wide meant a potential amputation. No one stepped outside the invisible lines. The game ended. The unit shouldered their packs and continued the advance. They took their objective. No casualties from the match, no mines detonated. The Christmas Truce match, 1914. By December of that year, the War of Maneuver had calcified into a continuous line of trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland. The logic of the Western Front was a logic of industrial attrition, but the men executing it were still human. On Christmas Eve, across the Ypres salient, German soldiers began placing candles on their parapets and singing carols. The British responded in kind. This was not a top-down order. It was a spontaneous, localized collapse of the combat mindset, driven by sheer physical proximity and a shared misery. The trench lines were sometimes only 30 meters apart, close enough to smell the enemy's cooking. A mood of live and let live had already taken root in quiet sectors, where informal truces allowed the recovery of dead bodies. The Christmas Truce scaled this phenomenon to a mass event. Roughly 100,000 troops participated. Men climbed out of their trenches into no man's land, exchanging tobacco, tinned food, and uniform buttons. The critical enabler was a common linguistic and cultural baseline. Many German soldiers had worked in Britain before the war and spoke English. They asked about Football League results. The leap from trading cigarettes to kicking a ball was a logical psychological step, a way to formalize the ceasefire through a shared ritual that replaced the rifle with a rule book. Accounts describe several kickabouts, often with a makeshift ball, though the matches were more chaotic scrums than organized sport. The high commands on both sides reacted with immediate fury, issuing strict orders against fraternization. The act of playing football at gunpoint exposed a fragile truth. The cohesion of an army depends on the dehumanization of the enemy. Once you see a sniper as a barber cutting hair in no man's land, the system of industrialized killing begins to short-circuit. A pitch can become a prison when the crowd is armed. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Drop your idea for the next episode in the comments.